I think the most surprising thing I heard was he was a group CTO. He was one of the most technical people in the company. And he said to me, Minette, you're asking the wrong question because you're asking, what are my weaknesses coming into this role? And you should be asking instead, what am I bringing that no one else could bring into this role? And I was like, I actually got goosebumps when he said that to me. And I felt like he was really acknowledging that I brought something different. I brought a different perspective, which they needed. I brought a different background, which they needed.
Welcome back. We have another great episode for you today. Today, we have Minette Norman joining us, and Minette is an award-winning author, speaker, and leadership consultant who previously spent decades leading global technical teams in the Silicon Valley software industry. Minette knows that when groups embrace diversity in all its forms, breakthroughs emerge and innovation escalates. Her most recent position before starting her consultancy was as Vice President of Engineering Practice at Autodesk. She was responsible for influencing more than 3,500 engineers around the globe. She focused on state-of-the-art engineering practices while nurturing a collaborative and inclusive culture. As the author of The Boldly Inclusive Leader and the co-author of the Psychological Safety Playbook, Minette is committed to helping leaders unleash their full potential of the people in their organization. Minette, we could not be more thrilled to have you join us here today.
I could not be more thrilled than having this conversation with you.
Amazing. So I'll get us kicked off here because I know Archita and I are both super excited to dive right in. One of the questions I have to ask you is you spent 30 years in STEM and you started your career in software in Silicon Valley. And you talk a little bit about being an only and how some of the there really pushed you to create your first book on psychological safety. So can you talk to us a little bit about what you experienced as an only and what was the catalyst for you starting the book?
Yeah, I think the easiest thing is to tell you about that last role that I had, because that I think was what informed me doing the work that I do now. So I worked my way through Silicon Valley, starting as a technical writer, taking on management roles and then bigger and bigger leadership roles until 25 years later, I ended up as this VP of engineering practice in a big company. We were like 10,000 at the time when I took over. Now, I had never been an engineer myself, but I had been in technical writing. I had been in localization. I had led engineers. So I got as technical as you can be without being an engineer, doing the coding myself. And then I found myself applying for this job as VP of engineering practice. And it was at a time when the company was going through this huge transition from desktop software to cloud software. And they really wanted someone who could do things differently and who could see things differently. But there I was applying. First of all, that role had always been filled by men in the past. There had been a series of male engineers as VP of engineering. And suddenly I was applying, and I had been senior director of localization at the time, trying to move into this engineering role. And the SVP who was interviewing me for the job said, Minette, you have two strikes against you. So one is that you were never an engineer yourself. And the other is that the engineering leadership in this company is a boys' club. And you're going to have to, yeah, he actually said that explicitly out loud. In some ways, he was just being brutally honest. He was saying, and it was true, all of the leaders in engineering across the company at the time were all men. Now, that has since changed somewhat. But when I was there, literally all the directors and senior directors of engineering were men. And he said to me, I need to see if you can break into this club. So here's the first only, like I'm going to be potentially the first woman in the role, the first liberal artist in the role who's not by training a software developer. And so I came into the role. I did get the role. I had to basically do a 90-day trial and I did get the role. And I did the role for about 5 years, loved it, learned so much. But, and here's a big but, is that even though I had privilege, I had power, I had influence, I never felt like I was in the inside club. And I just sensed this feeling of there's an insiders club and there's everyone else. And I, no matter what I do, can't quite find my way into this inner circle of the people who get time with the executive staff, who get all these opportunities, who get a lot of visibility. I felt like I had to fight all the time for my message, for my work. And at the same time, I was championing a lot of women. I was doing a lot of mentoring. I was getting more and more involved in our DEI program that was emerging at the time. And I just felt like this is so common that people feel they don't have a voice, they're not appreciated because they just don't conform to the group norms. They're somehow different, they're somehow other, they're maybe the only, or they're just a minority, right, in some way. And so ultimately, I did this work for a while. I felt like I made a big difference. Leadership changed. It was time for me to move on. And I realized what I want to do, because I spent 30 years learning these hard lessons, I want to help leaders do better. I think leaders mostly have really good intentions, but have no idea where to start. And I don't think they know how to create the conditions where everyone feels like they're part of the in group, where they all have a voice, where they're all appreciated. And that's why I got really interested first, as you said, in psychological safety and then in the broader sort of field of inclusion. But psychological safety, because so much of the time I didn't and others didn't feel like we could speak our truths. We would have something to say, but weren't sure that our voice was welcome. Or when we did speak up, we were often either ignored or ridiculed or just marginalized for having a different idea. And I felt this is where the innovation and the new ideas come from, the people who think differently, but we're not enabling them to fully participate. So I decided I wanted to spend this phase of my career at age 60 plus to helping leaders do better.
I know Archita and I are about to fall out of our seats because everything that you just said, it's like taking me to flashbacks of our own lives as women in STEM is crazy. And look, before we continue, can we just say 60 plus? Oh my God. You're gorgeous. I would never tell people that. I'd be like, I'm in my 40s forever. You're gorgeous.
Well, the funny thing is I'm 64. I just turned 64 in June, and I'm public about my age because part of the othering that we do is about age. And when I left STEM, when I left the software industry, I was 59 and a half years old. And I felt like no one would hire me if I wanted to get hired. I colored my hair all the time I was in tech because I didn't feel like I could be that gray haired woman. And now I'm fully embracing it and saying my age out loud because I think that's something we also need to destigmatize.
Absolutely. We just recently had Cindy Gallup on our show. And
love her so much.
She just literally gave me a virtual slap because I was like, Cindy, how do you have so much clarity, like with everything that you're saying? And, Minette, this comes through with what you are saying with your journey of being an only and then why you chose to do what you do. And then Cindy told me, Archita, it's called 64 years of experience. It's experience, Archita. That's what it is. That's where clarity comes from. Because in your early years, in your career, even like mid-career, right? Like you're looking for, not for shortcuts necessarily, but you're looking for ways in which you can shorten that time towards achieving whatever your imagination or destination of success looks like. And sometimes you strive for that clarity, you strive for that way in which to show up. And sometimes you just need to wait out the time on earth and be grateful that you have that time on earth as well. So I want to dig in a little bit because it's just amazing because a lot of times we speak to, as Olivia said, both of us are engineers. We've had so many only journeys. And for this leader of yours to say, you have two strikes against you right off the bat, we acknowledge it. This is a situation. And then for you to recognize that I'm going to find a way to thrive, which is one of our common themes here, and not just merely survive while I'm in this workspace, but then step away 5 years later, knowing, yes, I had this privilege, I had all of these seats at the table, but I still didn't feel like I was in. So you mentioned something that's really interesting. I can't remember where I read this, but you said that you had a listening tour at Autodesk that you did. And I'm just really curious, when you did this listening tour, because I'm guessing this was at the beginning of like your whole Autodesk kind of journey and your first 90 days. Could you help us understand as you're gaining an opportunity to even get a listening ear into this boys club, or you're gauging the kind of leaders you're going to be serving, working alongside of, etc. What were some of the most surprising insights you gained? And how did that influence your next 5-year leadership decision and journey as well?
So first of all, I was really transparent with all of them. I set up time on their calendar and I said, look, I'm applying for this job. I would love to understand what you are dealing with as an engineering leader, dealing with everything we're encountering as a company. What are you concerned with? What do you think we need in terms of leadership and change and transformation? And what, if any, are your concerns about having me in this role? So I just asked them point blank. Like I wanted to just not hide anything. Is look, I'm doing a trial. So do you have concerns about the fact that I'm not a coder myself or whatever it is? And I don't know how many people I met with, but it was a lot. It was over 10 in terms of leaders. And I was going across all the divisions and all the product groups. And what was so interesting, and I didn't expect this, was that I mostly heard, we're not concerned about you in terms of your lack of being an engineer because we've seen you, like they knew me from my prior role. We know you're well respected. We know you're a really good communicator. We know you have driven change. We need change in engineering. We don't actually need the same kind of leadership that we've had. I think the most surprising thing I heard was he was like a CTO, he was a group CTO. He was one of the most technical people in the company. And he said to me, Minette, you're asking the wrong question because you're asking, what are my weaknesses coming into this role? And you should be asking instead, what am I bringing that no one else could bring into this role? And I was like, I actually got goosebumps when he said that to me. And I felt like he was really acknowledging that I brought something different. I brought a different perspective, which they needed. I brought a different background, which they needed. And so the fact that I really got great embrace by this community, which surprised me. And there was no one who said, no, you can't do this role. I did get the role. And because of what I heard during that listening tour, I knew what people were concerned about. It wasn't about me personally. It was about the technology changes and the other things. And so I knew what I need to deal with is the things people fear, which is change and having to rewrite our code bases and all of these things. And I can just dive into being myself. I don't have to pretend to be someone else, something I'm not. I'm just going to be myself in this role because that's what they said they needed and that they wanted. Even though it was a really hard 90 days, I must say there were ups and downs along the way, but I felt like it was an endorsement also, and it gave me strength when I did take on the role officially.
You know what I love about this? A couple of things I think it's really important for our listeners to catch in what you just said. First of all, you had the courage to apply for the job. Yes. Regardless of the fact that it had previously only been held by men, regardless of the fact that you weren't an actual engineer, you were technical, but not like a degreed engineer at the time. You did not let that stop you. I'm going to go for this job and see what happens. So that first step is that courage, knowing that you wanted the job. So you knew what you want and you had courage to set about getting it, regardless of the nonsense about the 90-day trial period, a whole nother session. But regardless of what they threw at you, you were like, okay, like this job is mine. I'm going through it. Now, the second thing that you said that I think it is really important for our listeners to pick up on is that through your listening tour, you realized that you had been telling yourself stories. You had been telling yourself they're not going to embrace me. They have all these concerns. It's going to be an uphill battle. And what you found out once you were actually in it is, oh, hold on. They know who I am and it's totally fine. It's totally cool. And you found an advocate in it that said to you, that gave you some unsolicited feedback, which is a gift, right? We have to change the way we look at feedback. They're like, hey, show up with your cape on. Tell us your superpowers, right? Stop looking for us to validate maybe the soft spots because of the stories you had told yourself. Instead, tell us what you're capable of. We already know you're great. I love that. And I think so many times when we interview women, we find this common theme where we are preemptively talking ourselves out of something because we've concocted some story in our mind based on very real experiences. That let me not ignore that fact. But we've told ourselves a story that ends up not being true. So I love all of that. Fear tends to hold us captive. This is why I felt it's so important to call out those steps because you might have felt the fear, but you went through with it anyways. Anytime you show up as an only, we hear this from our lived experiences, but from a lot of the women that we speak to, you get fear that pops up in so many different places. Fear that I've never seen anyone do this. Fear that I won't be received. Fear that it's going to be hard or some Yahoo's going to say some nonsense to me and upset me in the process. How did you overcome your fear in this? Hi, everyone. My name is Olivia Cream. If you are a corporate girly and you are struggling, you're feeling stuck, maybe you're feeling underpaid, overqualified, you're struggling with your boss, or bigger yet, you're even trying to clearly articulate what it is that you want from your corporate career, I am the coach for you. So if you're ambitious and you've got goals to accomplish and you want to accomplish them quickly, check out my website, oliviacream.com. I would love to help you reach your goals.
Hi, everybody. I'm Archita Fritz, your other host of the Embracing Only podcast. If you're ready to leave corporate or you've changed a couple of corporate jobs and want to start a profitable side brilliance, you've made the decision, but you feel unsure of the next steps, here's how I can help you. I can guide you through a successful transition to entrepreneurship to help turn those ideas into profit. So reach out to me on LinkedIn or visit me on architafritz.com to accelerate your empowered transitions. Now, back to the episode.
What an interesting question. Because, yeah, of course the fear was there and you picked up on it. Like I was afraid that they'd see me as an imposter or whatever it is. But I'll tell you what it was. So before I applied for this job, I was in another role where I led a really large transformation of the localization department. So that's the department that was responsible for getting everything translated and ready for international markets. And it was a highly technical role because we were very involved in machine translation and automation and all sorts of things that were cutting edge. And I had to do like really hard things in that role, including downsizing hugely, reimagining what the department might do. We were threatened with being eliminated completely unless we did something different. So I had spent several years reimagining, transforming a department from we're going to cut the whole department and outsource it to this department is now seen as like cutting edge, industry leading, presenting at conferences. And that was under my leadership. So I had a certain level of confidence that I know how to do the hard things. And I'd gotten public validation in the company and outside of the company from the industry. And so I had this certain level of confidence that I know how to lead change. I think if I had not had that experience, I probably would not have dared apply for the engineering leadership job. But I saw it as really just another step in my leadership journey because I did know how to lead change. And I knew how to lead resistors and detractors and people who said, we can't do that. It's never going to work because I had been through that. And I also had learned, one of the things that I had learned maybe is my superpower is where I see what engineers sometimes can't do so well, which is I am good at taking complicated information and distilling it into simplicity. And I can get to the context. What do our executives need to know? What do our staff members need to know? And I'm good at communicating that. And I know that from working with engineers that they're often the opposite. They're really good at the details. They're really good at the details and sometimes not as good at the big picture or the context or the why. So I knew I was good at translating that for different audiences. And I thought often that's what we probably need as we're thinking about how do we transform engineering across highly siloed groups who didn't speak to one another, didn't collaborate. Well, you need someone who can explain the why and who can talk to everyone and present it in a clear way that everyone's going to get. And so I felt like I can do this. And yeah, I think having that track record really gave me confidence.
You were doing the hard things, first of all. Sometimes when you're doing the hard things, you're just like, oh, you hope that it gets easier, but then you're given another harder challenge and another harder challenge. And then sometimes you're just like, okay, freeze or flight, right? What's interesting is you went head first and you're like, hey, this presents another really interesting opportunity for me to move forward. You mentioned certain aspects of your leadership journey when you were in that previous role before the VP of engineering practice, where because of the circumstance, you had to do a lot of those difficult things like downsizing, etc. You speak in a couple of your previous podcast episodes about that cultural shift around failure. So as your team was consistently, and I'm using the word failure broadly, it wasn't a failure on your part per se, right? But it was just the construct of how your team was probably supported in that moment that might have led to all of those many different systemic failures. But how do you normalize failure on teams? Because Minette, I work with a lot of scale-ups and startups today. There are a lot of founder-led scale-ups and startups. And what I hear consistently is the founders echoing this just as they're getting ready to grow like dramatically. Well, if I just let them make mistakes, that'll be a problem. Like I have to call it out. Like I have to do something about it. But how do you normalize failure? Like the whole idea of failing forward seems so foreign to them, or debriefing for failure seems so foreign to them that they're afraid to engage with it. So if we have any listeners here who are leaders, what would be your direction on how they can shift that culture around failure?
Well, there's so much there because I think we know this, and this has certainly been proven through history, is that there is no innovation without failure. And I think it's just a concept we all have to really embrace. Are you trying to do something new and different? If you want to disrupt, if you want to do something new and innovative, there will be failure because look at science, for example. If you're working in science, you just expect many experiments will not work until we get to a successful one. And I think we have to treat the business world a little bit more like that. Now, I know we're beholden to shareholders and funders and all of that. And yet still, if we want to innovate, we have got to give some leeway to ourselves as leaders and to our employees to experiment, to learn from what goes badly. And I think what I've seen in the business world is that failure is taboo. And there's this expectation always, and it felt like magical thinking. We're going to be on time. We're going to be on budget, and we're going to come out with this amazing product, right? I see you laughing, Archita and Olivia, because like we have to compromise on something here, right? But leaders often say, no, these are non-negotiables. Well, how are you going to do all of that and innovate and do something new? And so I think we have to give ourselves some leeway to say, yeah, we cannot have the big failure, a very large failure, but there are going to be great experiments we can run along the way to prevent the big failure. So let's have smaller failures that we learn from, that we talk about openly, and then that we can recover from and do better going forward. And I think that's part of it, is it's so rare to be able to talk openly about failures. And it was one of the things I learned as a leader. Like I thought I had to be perfect. And then the first time when I totally messed up, and I went public about it. And I actually said, I messed up and I made a bad decision. And this is what I learned. And this is what I changed. And this is what we're going to do differently. Instead of being perceived as, oh, she's a terrible leader, I tell you, I gained so much respect from my team because they said they really respected that I was able to change course based on new information, as opposed to digging in and just, we're going to do this no matter what. And so I think it is really about running smaller experiments to learn from instead of having this massive failure. And I remember like deploying when I was leading a technical team and we rolled out a new piece of software and one of the big features didn't work and we had to recover so quickly. And it feels like what you want to do and what you're tempted to do is point fingers and say, who screwed up here? And instead, what we need to do is go all hands on deck. How are we going to recover from this? And then when we recover, what are we going to learn and what are we going to do differently? That's the only way forward. It does no good to point fingers, but there is a lot of scapegoating and finger pointing and blaming that I see when there are failures, because then people are going to tend to hide mistakes and failures instead of being open and saying, look, I learned something. We need to change our process here or something like that.
And what's very interesting, and I wanted to ask you this question, because there is an intersection here with DEI and innovation, and then companies' fear of failure. And I'll add another one, individuals' fear of failure, right? There's this Venn diagram of all this stuff intersecting. And so if we break it down a little bit, I want to go a little bit deep here because I want our audience to really grasp this concept of fear and failure. It is not a bad thing. You can fail a million times. You only have to win once, right? You only have to figure it out once to get to where you're going. And so in this current climate that we're in, at this point, we know the data says that diverse teams outperform homogeneous teams. It's not a question. It's not debatable. Like the data's there, like it's done, it's over. Now we see ourselves, even before we started to roll back DEI, specifically in the States, but I know it's happening in other places around the globe as well, where we're hearing, okay, we're rolling back DEI, but we know that DEI is a significant contributor to organic growth, right? Your diverse team is going to come up with the best solution, not just a solution. And you find business leaders, seemingly super smart people, not connecting these dots, right? If they are on the diverse teams because they want the best solution train, Then they get the diverse teams, and then the teams come in and then they're stifled. It's do what I say, don't fail because we can't afford to fail. And then they kill everything that makes the diverse team successful in the first place. How do you unpack that for your clients? How do you unpack that for individuals or even for yourself as a human?
Oh, I'm so glad you went there because, yeah, that is a very big intersecting Venn diagram. And this is how I unpack it. Yes, the data is there. It is indisputable data that diverse teams outperform homogeneous teams. However, those diverse teams do not outperform the homogeneous teams unless they have a culture of inclusion and psychological safety. Because if you bring in this highly diverse workforce and you put this diverse team together to solve some of the gnarliest problems your company has, you don't enable them to experiment, fail, speak up when there's a problem, ask hard questions, disagree, then what you get is groupthink. You can bring a diverse team together and then they all feel this need to conform and need to agree. And you don't get to tap into the power of that diversity, the diversity of brains and experiences and cultures and personalities, because everyone feels this pressure to get it exactly right, to be like everybody else and to agree with one another. And so it's this constant investment we have to make, not just in bringing in a diverse workforce and having equitable practices to make sure everyone has the same opportunities, but also to relentlessly invest in this culture building. And that's really the piece that I do with leaders. How do I show up every day to set the tone for asking those hard questions, for being the dissenting voice, for not always going along with the group and instead saying, what if we did something different? Or I'm seeing something differently. And that the leaders set the tone for that. But I think to your question, Olivia, why they're not connecting the dots is a little puzzling to me. But I think sometimes it's that they think they've checked the box by hiring a diverse workforce. If they're still doing, that's part of it, that we've checked the box, we're done. And honestly, the work has to begin before you hire the diverse workforce and needs to continue forevermore.
Gosh, sorry, I'm like, yes, hallelujah, amen, all of the above, because I see this on the regular. I was in a call with someone yesterday who we're talking about a leadership team with them. And they're like, well, I don't want to just hire someone. I just want to get someone. He fell short of saying diversity hire, but pretty much just meant that. We can get them, but what if they're not the best candidate? I'm like, dude, I don't want to present a candidate that is not a white male to you anymore right now, because the environment does not exist. You absolutely are looking at it as a checkbox exercise at the moment. And it's really not a psychologically safe space for this leader to thrive. So you talk about a really interesting concept in your first book, Minette, which is the psychological first aid in practice.
The psychological safety playbook is the first one.
Yes, it is the first one, right? Exactly. And so you talk about this concept when you're in a high stress situation, because I've been in a situation 3-4 years ago where we were probably in one of the most diverse teams you could possibly find. Below the iceberg was like sharks, whales, booby traps, and everything else you could possibly imagine. And this was during the middle of an M&A, a merger and acquisition. It's a very high stress situation. You talk about how leaders can create this psychological first aid during these high stress situations in order to help all the teams build significant resilience. So can you walk our listeners through what you mean by that as you're putting that playbook to action, essentially?
Yeah, well, you actually mentioned it earlier, Archita, when you said fight, flight, freeze, right? So we are so often in that state of sensing danger at work, right? This is a high stakes situation. I'm being attacked. We're being attacked. And one of the things that's so interesting about the human brain is that we do not distinguish between real physical danger, like I'm about to get attacked by a shark or I'm about to get run over by a car, and my boss just criticized me in public in a meeting. What happens is that our brain, and it's basically our amygdala firing, trying to keep us safe and alive. It's our biology. And so we go into this very narrow thinking of I am in survival mode and I'm not at my best because I can do only one of three things. I can freeze, I can flee, or I can fight. And fight is often how we express ourselves when we're feeling under threat. We yell at someone, we attack back, we criticize, we deflect blame. And these are the situations where we cannot create an inclusive and safe environment for everybody. We shut down the voices we need to hear. If I'm in a leadership role and someone says, Minette, you've missed something really important, and they do that in front of my whole staff or my whole company, if I'm not careful, I am going to react badly to that. So one of the things that I this is in both books, actually, because it's so important, is that we have to recognize when we're getting into these states of fight, flight, freeze, defensiveness, and we have to just learn to pause. We have to learn to take a breath or take a sip of water, compose ourselves, get our brain back in gear where we can think clearly, and then thank someone for a comment or ask a clarifying question like, can you tell me more about that? I want to make sure I've understood you. In these high stress moments, that's how we can keep the dialogue going instead of shutting it down. We can continue to invite divergent perspectives instead of silencing them. But we have to be very mindfully aware of how we are reacting as individuals, because our brain's instinct is to keep ourselves in survival mode. And that is not helpful in the workplace. And so it's something we have to constantly combat our biology, basically.
Yeah, it's spot on. And I obviously am not as good at this as you are. I still, being prior military, still have my hair triggers here or there. But it's so true. I think there are certain things based on your childhood or your own trauma or whatever, that if it happens to you, you're going to react, right?
Yes.
And it's learning your own tells. My Archita knows this. If my ears start to get hot, I'm like, I'm
Yes.
not going to say anything. I need to walk away for a second. I'll come back. I'm going silent because I know it's getting there. I'm curious about this, and I haven't read where you've made this distinction anywhere. As you work with women or corporations, have you noticed, do women tend to struggle with any particular portion of psychological safety more than others? Or do you think women and men struggle in the same way in environments where psychological safety maybe is not great?
What I've seen, and I think what I've experienced myself, is that when there is not a high level of psychological safety, women are often the first to suffer, because we so often are fighting for a seat at the table, fighting for a voice. And when it doesn't feel safe, we are, and this is how I experienced it, I would make sure that if I was going to say something in a meeting, it had to be the most well thought out, perfectly articulated thought. Whereas many of my male colleagues could get away with saying something off the top of their head because it's not a level playing field. We cannot pretend that it is. That often women and other people who feel marginalized in any way are often held to a different standard than white men are. And so I don't want to demonize white men, and I think that's destructive to do. But I will say that women often feel like they have to be more perfect than their male counterparts, and therefore they experience a lack of psychological safety, maybe more viscerally. And I have heard, like from clients, I've certainly heard when we talk about failure, even, I had a question when I was doing a workshop on psychological safety. Someone said, look, I am someone who is at the intersection of multiple marginalized groups. And I feel like I do not have the same ability to fail as others because I'm held to a different standard. So I think we have to acknowledge that it's not an equal playing field. I want it to be, and that's a lot of the work I'm trying to do. But today it isn't in many places.
Olivia has 80 different intersections in being a military vet, an African-American woman, an immigrant, everything. And we both share so many stories in this journey of being the first, the few, the only across the board. Once you do acknowledge it, because otherwise you're not going to thrive. You're going to just be stuck in that place of the world is against me. I'm never going to win. How am I going to survive here? And it's more than survival. It's about thriving, because Olivia does this whole program with women winning in the workplace. So how do you not just show up and you've got your seat at the table, but now how do you keep winning and keep growing as you've found your seat at the table and continue to make an impact in that space? The boldly inclusive leader, this concept of bold humility. I'm really curious, how does this challenge the traditional power dynamics in leadership? And what resistance have you observed when either yourself or individuals you worked with have tried to implement this mindset, especially as a woman, of bold humility?
Let me just take the word bold for a moment.
Yes.
I think that, when I think about being bold, it means like I'm going to be unflinching here. I'm going to actually go all in no matter what the headwinds are against me. The boldly inclusive, like I'm going to be inclusive even if people are saying we're not going to pay attention to this because it's the right thing to do and I know it. So in terms of humility, I think what would it mean to be boldly humble? I think that yeah, for women, we don't want to be negating our superpowers. We don't even have, we started out on this conversation of me asking, what do I not have that you're worried about? What is bold humility? It's being able to say, I see the world through my own lenses, no matter who I am. And I know that I don't see everything. And so I am going to invite other perspectives because I know I'm missing something. And so I think it's boldly humble to say, I've done my research and I really believe in this. And I believe I could have missed something. So tell me what I've missed.
I love that. But I think I have such an issue. And this is me. You're probably going to coach me live on air here. But I have such an issue with the word humble. And here's my beef with the word humble. And this is my lived experiences. So anybody listening, this is not some like scholarly work. I know you guys know, like I get super geeked out about anything that your brain is doing. This is not that. This is just life as Olivia sees it. But for marginalized people, I think the word humble is weaponized against us. It's, oh, be humble and accept these scraps I'm giving you. Oh, be humble and take this severely underpaid position and just be humble for what you get. Oh, be humble. You're a woman. You're lucky you're even in this job. And it makes me want to throw up and flip my desk, if I'm honest. So and as a matter of fact, I think I had posted a couple weeks ago, maybe it was more recent than that. Don't be humble. Be awesome. Like shine so bright in all your glory. Now, that doesn't mean walk around the earth being a jerk, right? You have to be smart enough to know that we really don't know anything. We're learning daily and you should be striving to learn daily. But I think I just have such a big hang up, both being a minority and being a woman, where over the course of my life, people who were not well-intended were like, oh, just be humble. And it's, hold on. Be humble.
I totally resonate with that. And in fact, I don't have the words boldly humble anywhere in my book because I agree with you. But I know. And yet I want to add on to what you said, Olivia. I think that we have to shine bright, especially anyone who feels only or other or marginalized. Do not hold back your brilliance and your light from the world. And I think that every single one of us, and maybe this is a little bit of bold humility, is that we all have to acknowledge that everyone, to your point, is learning. Everyone is a work in progress. And I think that's where some humility comes in, is that for ourselves, compassion for others, is that we're all learning together. And so we're going to screw up. We're going to have failures. And let's learn from them and do better every single day.
Yes. And I love how you described that. Even though I put you in a spot there, it was beautiful, Minette, which is I see the world through my own lenses. And I don't know everything that I see. So I'm going to invite other perspectives. So I really request our listeners to go back and listen to this part and almost write this down, because I wrote this down here in my notes, because it's just so beautiful and it's so true. No matter how intersectional your identity is, there is so much you have to learn and as you walk this world. And I absolutely empathize with my dear Olivia as well, with like how weaponized we all have felt when humble is thrown in our faces through our career. So 100% with you on that too. I'm just curious though, Minette, like as you look at the two books that you have shared with the world and the work that you do with so many clients here, one of the things I hear consistently when I'm talking to a Fortune 500 company right now, they just completed a complete rebrand, right? They bought these two entities together and they completed all of this cultural work. But their biggest challenge is measuring what they're trying to do right now is this psychological safety. They're like, how do we measure psychological safety? How do we measure the impact of coming together and creating a safe space for innovation? Because they really need to grow, accelerate, because two Greek folks have come together. So from your perspective and all of the work that you've done, for a lot of folks, it feels, and I hate to say this, but a lot of folks, it feels fluffy stuff. They're like, okay, psychological safety. But for the folks who experience it, it is very deep. We know what psychological safety feels like. So how do you make it more tangible for leaders who are navigating very diverse employee populations, who are trying to see progress with regards to the work they're being asked to do around psychological safety?
Well, it's so interesting because when I started trying to learn more about psychological safety, this was still when I was in tech, and I read Amy Edmondson's work. And Amy Edmondson back in, I feel like it was 2017, came out with the book, The Fearless Organization. And she's been researching psychological safety for decades. And then when I went out on my own, I signed up for a class on running psychological safety assessment based on Amy Edmondson's work. So to your client, Archita, you can tell them, we can run a survey for you. I can do it. I'm certified to do it. And they can keep measuring it. So that if they want to track progress, there's actually what's validated by a Harvard business professor who specializes in psychological safety. This is her methodology for measuring it. And I think that's good because many people need to see, like, where are we now? What's the baseline? Can we improve? Where I have a problem is that so many executives just do the measurements and they don't invest in the work. And so my work comes in, I'm happy to run a survey for you only if you commit to doing the follow-up work. And I'm going to come in and do training with you, and we're going to do work to how do we change this? Because measuring for measuring's sake will not move the needle in any way. We have to invest in the work because there's real work that has to be done.
Oh, Minette, you just hit my hot button.
They do surveys and then do no behavioral changes.
And then the people are like, you keep peppering me with surveys. I keep saying the same thing and nothing changes.
Exactly.
Right?
And then the cynicism grows and grows, right?
Exactly. Okay. So I think, one thing that I found super interesting, and I think we're coming up on time, so I'm going to ask you a little bit about your co-author for a second here. And it's very purposeful for me because I want to dispel some myths that are floating around in the atmosphere right now. But your co-author, I think this is your co-author for your
the psychological safety playbook, because the other book I wrote alone. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Whoa. Okay. So your co-author, you guys actually wrote that book and had never met in person. Is that true?
That is correct. Yeah. So I'll tell you that story. And so it goes back to this class that I signed up for to take psychological safety, learn how to do psychological safety assessments. My co-author, Caroline Helbig, lives in Bonn, Germany. We met in that class and it was like, 30 people. And then we were in a smaller cohort within the class, and she and I just clicked. We really hit it off. And then I was on someone else's podcast and she heard me say this one thing. I said, I signed up for this class because I wanted practical ideas for how to help clients increase psychological safety, when all I learned is how to run assessments, and I'm getting frustrated. So she emailed me and she wrote me this email that was subject line crazy idea. And she said, Minette, I heard you on Rob's podcast. You said there's no practical information for psychological safety. I agree. I can't find it either. She's a leadership consultant. I'm a leadership consultant. She goes, why don't we put our brains together and write something? And so we started on a Zoom call. She put a Miro board together. We collaborate on this online whiteboard that we've been working on for years. We wrote the whole book. We got it out in the world. We won a bunch of awards. And we finally met in person when we were invited to speak last July in Lisbon. And that was after the book had been out in the world already.
That is so incredible.
Fun story, because it's a similar journey of Olivia and myself. With almost 2 years before we met in person, because the listeners have heard this story, but I cold stalked Olivia on Microsoft Teams. We were working in the same company, and I watched her speak at one of the internal events, and I was like, I need to get to know this woman because she's amazing. And then I messaged her and I'm like, hey, you don't know me. I'm over here in Germany. Would you be willing to jump on like a quick call? I'd love to just get to know you. And then she's never been able to get rid of me since. And then we met. We really connected instantly on so many levels. She came onto our podcast in 2020 because this was peak pandemic. She helped us shape some workshops as well that we did for our team over in EMEA at that time in Europe, Middle East, and Africa region. And then when my co-host at that time decided to step away to take a break from the podcast, I pitched this crazy idea. And I was like, hey, Olivia, what if you jumped on in and were a co-host as well? And then we have gotten a chance to go speak in LA together and everything else. But we met for the first time last year on my way to Disneyland in Florida.
I love that. And it totally busts the myth that you need to be in person to forge real human connection. Caroline and I forged the most amazing human connection, as you two have, years before we ever met in person.
Yes, it is.
That is exactly the point here as we're coming to a close. It's like our environments tell us so much stuff, what we can do, what we can't do, what, you should be doing. There's so much noise in our environment. that I just want to leave our listeners with. None of that matters. The only thing that matters is what you want, what you believe about yourself, and how much you are willing to work to accomplish your goals. The rest of it is truly just noise. So as we're coming to a close here, I knew this was going to be an absolutely fantastic episode. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your knowledge and sharing your journey with us. How can our listeners find you? How can they get a hold of your book? How do they get a hold of you?
Yes, please. I would love that. My books are available on all the online book sites. You can reach me through my website, MinetteNorman.com, or on LinkedIn. I'm very active on LinkedIn. I think Archita and I connected there immediately. So yeah, find me on LinkedIn or through my website. Get the books, invite me in. I love to do this work, and I really would love to help many more people around the globe.
Absolutely wonderful. Well, that's it for us. Do you have any final parting messages for our audience here?
No, thank you so much for leading through action, Minette, and trying to bust all of the journeys of an only and showing us how you can thrive in spite it all. This has been such an amazing episode. Thank you for this transformative experience. And to everybody listening, go buy the book. Highly recommended. Thank you for joining us on the Embracing Only podcast, Minette.
Thank you for having me.